You really want to hear war stories? Okay. This is a story I was told by my grandfather. About when he and his brother were kids and spoke to their grandfather. Who was a WW1 vet. My great-great-grandfather. It's malicious to be sure. But it's kind of messed up. My grandfather and his family are from Sonderjylland, which is today the most southern bit of Denmark. But during WW1 it was the most northern part of Germany. The people there identified as Danes and spoke Danish, but were Germans and therefore had to fight in the war on the German side. Never wanted to talk about the war for obvious reasons, and people also had to be mindful not to drop anything, as loud noises apparently set him off. People in the family always respected this, except for my grandfather's brother, who wanted to hear some cool war stories and kept pestering him for it, asking what he did and if he killed anyone and the like. Keep in mind this is a bratty child around the age of 8. And PTSD wasn't fully understood in this time. This is the late 40s we're talking. Gigi kept saying no and the boy kept pestering. Eventually the boy started leaning back in his chair only to lean forward again so that it would make a loud bang against the floor. And he did this several times while his grandfather visibly shook with each thump, while the rest of the family told him to stop. But eventually Gigi shouted at him to stop and that he would tell him some war stories. Turns out my Gigi grandfather and his regiment, Regiment 84, committed some pretty heinous war crimes in Belgium. I've hidden some details below. Click on it to read if you want to. Apparently they were constantly told stories about German troops being killed in horrific ways in surprise attacks by Belgian civilians. And as a result they were told to kill any who seemed suspicious. He explained how they really feared even old ladies and children. So they shot them. They burnt down their homes. He even told of coming across an old man walking down the road. And some of the other soldiers thought that he was going to report their position to French troops. So they stripped him naked and beat him to death. Needless to say, the boy never asked for stories again. My grandfather describes his grandfather as a kind man. Except of course if you try to press him on the war. And I think it really goes to show what war does to a person. That a seemingly kind person becomes capable of doing such things. TLDR. I'm related to a monster. It's kind of weird. There is a reason that veterans of war don't often want to speak of their experiences. What they saw, what they endured, and things that they did can be traumatic. Good people can do horrendous things in war. My grandpa was a WW2 vet, and the only time he talked about the war was to dissuade my dad from enlisting for Vietnam. He assumed he was going to get drafted anyways, so thought he'd volunteer. Definitely had PTSD and survivor's guilt. Being below decks trying to sleep at Pearl Harbor listening to his fellow sailors on the sunk Arizona, I believe it was, clanging for help only for the clanging to slow then stop. And that was the first engagement. You're not related to a monster. You're related to a survivor who lived through a brutal war that had almost no rules. I don't know if I would call him a monster. More a product of the times and environment he was in. War can make people do some really messed up stuff that they would never have dreamed of in their worst nightmares. WW1 and WW2, then Korea and Vietnam showed that, and it got progressively worse. The monsters were those in command in most cases. I am not justifying heinous acts, just saying it may have been your GG body, but it was the command mindset that was in control. I did my time in the military. Fortunately, I did not see combat, but I did work with guys coming back. The soldier is not the human. My grandpa was in a few wars and he never talked about it. He was stationed in Hawaii when Pearl Harbor happened and was hurt. My dad was in Vietnam, and sometimes when he had a bad night, he'd scream about the bodies in the water and the ocean red with blood. We never discussed any of it. Both were Navy vets. So you know it had to be bad. And none of us asked any grandparents about it. The horrors they faced and depravity they may have committed in the name of freedom are things we never wanted to know about. My dad was an awesome, kind, caring person, but his nightmares were enough to scare anyone just by what he screamed, yelled. If you look back far enough, everyone is related to a monster. For example, Genghis Khan has approximately 16 million male descendants living today. Another example, go back far enough and literally everyone is descended from someone who owned and/or took slaves. Had a kid from my class in the 80s. Started telling that the Holocaust was made up. I told my dad and he flipped out. Called a few friends and came to school to find out who said this. The teachers tried to defuse the issue, but that wasn't happening. My dad had found 2 of the guys from his old unit and 3 survivors from Auschwitz. My father's unit had been part of the force to free the place. He showed pictures and the survivors told their stories. Made that kid cry. My dad was happy to talk to the kids' parents who were the twits who originally said it. He made them cry too. My dad was a kind of mellow guy till you pissed him off. And he and my grandfather and uncles are the reason that I went into the infantry. Wow. A side of the war that we don't hear about or read in history books where I am from. So the boy intentionally triggered his grandfather's PTSD because he didn't get his way. I don't blame Gigi for snapping. Don't mention the war. My wife's paternal grandfather was with the U.S. Army in World War II and was awarded the Silver Star during the Battle of the Bulge. He never told his story to any of his kids or grandkids for obvious reasons until my wife and I started dating and he found out I was in the Air Force. I spent few years in Germany and I visited a lot of the battle sites all over Europe both during World War I and World War II. When he heard about this, that's when he starts telling his time in combat. I was a flight medic my entire career, and every time I transport injured or sick patients I don't ask them the events leading to their injuries. I do remind them I would be there for them if they needed to vent and/or just BS. I hope your great-grandfather was able to find peace in his life. I'm sure that he was a good man that had to endure severe trauma from the war. And it is, sadly, perhaps due to those who experienced war not talking about it to their kids and subsequent generations that we still have war. Maybe if more people heard the war stories of beating strip-naked old people to death, they'd be less excited about the glory of war? And not vote for gung-ho warmongering politicians? Just a thought from someone whose auntie told them recently about a relative I'd never heard of because they froze to death. Aged 20. In Korea. After being shot on the front lines and unable to be rescued. Back in the 50s. A workmate served in Timor and was a broken man from his experiences. He was tragically involved in a collateral damage incident with some innocent young locals being used as human shields by the opposing forces. After years of trying to silence the internal torture with nightly alcohol abuse, he deleted himself at home. I had to do a project in high school where I had to interview a family member who served in Vietnam. I got a 0 because my papa would only say, "Yeah, I was there." I figured it'd be best not to press. My husband's grandfather was killed at Gallipoli and buried in Turkey. His own father enlisted at 16. When my husband wanted to enlist at 18, his father insisted, "No son of mine will take the king's shilling." Generations on generations of his family have fought and died in wars for the crown. His inheritance includes frequent dreams of bombs, blood, guns and death. Intergenerational trauma is real. Even the crows know. My grandparents also never wanted to talk about the war. If you asked, we don't want to talk about it, or be reminded about that horrible time. Ask again. You wanna get a smack in the head? We just told you no. Well, I knew I shouldn't ask again after that warning. And never did. Kinda sad, so stories about history are lost forever. Your GG isn't a monster. He was told by his superiors that one thing was true, whether it was or wasn't. He trusted his leadership to lead him appropriately. This is what he was trained to do. Never question. Later, he probably realized that his leadership lied, and all those things he did were horribly wrong, and he blamed himself and his peers for doing them. The simple fact remains. Soldiers are trained to never question authority and follow commands immediately and efficiently. If they don't, people die. GG was simply a soldier following orders that he later hated himself for. I feel for the things he was put through in the name of protecting his country. It's so sad he had to live his life knowing what he did in the name of following orders was wrong. All we can do is recognize the fact that most vets never speak of the horrors they witnessed in war. For this very reason. When I was young, we lived in a townhouse. Right next door lived an elderly couple who just adored us kids. They always had treats for us, let us romp around their yard, and I fondly remember being instructed on how to care for the grapevines they had growing out back. I was just learning about WW2 and it was a point of absolute fascination. My love for military history was only reinforced by the fact this was the "we're only showing WW2 stuff" era of the History Channel. Well, I asked my elderly neighbor if he had been in the war. He said yes. Like so many others, he had been a part of the war effort. I badgered him for stories. At first, he would only smile and say something along the lines of, "Maybe another time." As I continued to ask, he graduated to telling me funny stories from the war. Then, one day, he said that he had killed 3 men that he knew of. He recounted the first one that he had killed. It was in Italy. They were in vicious combat and this young German decided that he had enough. He only wanted to get away. My neighbor told me he shot this German in the back several times as he tried to run away from the fight. As he put it, he was only a kid. This coming from the man who was IIRC 19 at the time. They rolled him over as they advanced, and close to 60 years later he said he could recall every detail. His face, his expression, his hair, everything. He said he still dreamed of it to that very day. I remember I looked at him, and while physically we were sitting on his back porch, mentally he was back Italy so many years ago. It was at that moment, at the age of 9 or 10 or so, that I learned not everyone comes back. Since then, I've had many friends and acquaintances go off to war. Many of them were combat arms. Not once have I asked them to recount what they went through. War is horrible, yet it makes people money. It will never end, ever.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epicaricast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.